Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We'll get going. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we are streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube. And if you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. This week, we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of the opening of these museums with free admission Friday through Sunday, thanks to the Community Foundation, through funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. On Saturday, December 10th, we'll also have train rides for kids, live music, food trucks, and guided tours. Then on Sunday, December 11th, we'll show the Muppet Christmas Carol movie here in this space at 2 p.m. And then I hope you'll come back next Wednesday, when we'll wrap up the 2023 season of History's Lunch with a conversation between Marty Stewart and Karen Cronin, his friend who helped design the book that accompanies the exhibit. That fabulous exhibit closes at the end of this year. If you have not been upstairs to see it, do that soon. Today, we are delighted to welcome Muscogee Nation Tribal Historic Preservation Officer Turner Hunt to present the Natchez Diaspora 1730 to present. We have MDAH Chief Archaeologist Cindy Carter Davis to thank for today's program, and I'd like to invite her to the stage now to say a few words about Turner Hunt and the relationship between MDAH and the Muscogee Nation.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. As Chris said, I am the Chief Archaeologist for MDAH. This week, we are honored to host our first annual Tribal Summit. Excuse me. A chance for our state and federal partners to meet with our tribal descendant communities here at the two Mississippi museums. Sorry, I apologize for my nervousness. Not usually like this. When Chris and I started talking about the opportunity to use the summit as a kind of a bridge between History's Lunch and our ongoing tribal consultation, I knew exactly who I wanted to ask. And so I am honored to introduce Turner Hunt. Turner is the Historic Preservation Officer for Muscogee Nation. Excuse me. After his time on active duty in the Army, he utilized the GI Bill to go to the University of Oklahoma. In 2013, while working on his undergraduate degree, Muscogee Nation Historic and Cultural Preservation Department hosted the Muskegon Symposium, which invited academics to the nation to discuss the Creek history. During that meeting, some folks were asking, where are the Creek historians and archaeologists? That question led Turner to change his major, excuse me, in an attempt to fill that role. Since 2018, Turner has been employed by the Historic and Cultural Preservation Division, first as an archaeological tech and now as Historic Preservation Officer. He's participated in countless consultations, many of them with MDAH, across the historic area of interest for Muscogee Nation. The role of the TIPO is different for work in their ancestral homelands than it is on the Muscogee Nation Reservation, where the office has 101 D2 status, assuming the role of SHPO on various projects. The TIPO is also responsible for ensuring Section 106 compliance when federal funding is used by the nation, which is no small task, as the Muscogee Nation is the 4th largest tribe in the United States. And without further ado, I would like to introduce my friend and colleague, Turner Hunt.
Said there'd be a slight delay. I think I've got that taken care of. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Turner Hunt, as we've discussed. Today I want to talk to you about the Natchez Diaspora. I want to make it clear what a diaspora is. It's essentially the displacement of a people from their ancestral homelands. This has happened numerous times in Nahce history, but this is one of the first ones, starting with the French in 1730. Want to discuss a little bit of this timeline. 1730 to the present was almost 300 years. just a few years shy of tricentennial. So in order to try to accomplish that in 45 minutes, there's going to be some areas that are a little vague, that will be obviously discussions for future history of lunches, but I'm going to try my best to bring you up to date with the Nahce. So one of the things that really motivated me to give this talk is the fact that if you read about the Grand Village, even newer academic journals and articles that are written about them, they lead the conclusion to very, very small sentences about the what happened after. So some of these include being lost to history, the end of the Nahce. Some folks found homes amongst these other tribes. And so the idea of why I would be giving this talk is to prove that there's much more than these few sentences within a paragraph, within a much larger article over the folks living at Grand Village. So understanding that there's a little bit of time play with the movement out from the Grand Village area, I also want to state that the Grand Village is representative of the Nahce homelands. It, of course, is known as one of the capitals or the last things, but there were many Nahce towns or affiliated groups that lived in the whole area. So as we discuss and I talk about the Grand Village, I want you to know that that's actually representing a much larger region than just the site itself. And so we know that there was conflict that led to the old Nahce fort that's over in Louisiana, Catahoula Parish, I believe. And we're actually working with Louisiana SHPO regarding some of that stuff. So we understand that after the French made their pushes against the Nahce to push them out, to eradicate them, to commit genocide, however you want to phrase it, they went to a couple of places that are the main subjects of our discussion today. Amongst the Chickasaw, amongst the Cherokee, and amongst the Creek. And so these areas are kind of highlighted here amongst the map. So the 7 towns of the Chickasaw Nation will be kind of what I discuss first, a little bit of the history with the Cherokee, and most of what I'll discuss is amongst the history amongst the Creeks. So first, leaving the area around Grand Village and heading up to the Chickasaw, and they have in 1737 they drew a map which is associated with the 7 Chickasaw towns. On that map, here we can see up there the Nahce. So at this time, they were known to be living amongst Chickasaw, at least one faction of them. And having a town that is identified meant that they had a political identity there, or corporate identity is what Brad Lieb, I believe, explains it as. So to explain a little bit about the connection between the Chickasaw and the Creek, we need to kind of look a little bit at some of the trade routes that were being utilized by the British. And so this is a rather long route for goods to flow. And much like any other system of economics, the farther goods have to flow, the more expensive they are. And so the idea is that after their time with the Chickasaw, that the Nahce started to move to Creek country, and they met with the Beacon. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. But the idea is that Chickasaw also established what they called Oiasa, or breed camp, foreigners camp. And it seems to me that there's a little bit of a connection there between the Nahce, who were living in the area of breed camp, and the Chickasaws whom they were with. And I apologize, I forgot to caveat something. One of the areas that I will be vague over is histories that belong to other tribes. So there's many exciting adventures. Maybe adventure is not the right word. But, the major battles that occurred, the defense against the French, those victories, those are our Chickasaw stories to tell. And so as we also, when we get to the Cherokee, I'll remind you again that there's Cherokee stories to tell, but this is the Creek story. So I'll be vague over certain parts of it. So in 1757, a map was made that identified the northern part of the Upper Creek area. And there you can see Breed Camp and Abicucci, which is Little Abika. This area would eventually become part of the trade route of Adair. Make special notions of stopping at the storehouses at Breed Camp, which were essentially a Chickasaw, I believe Chickasaw Nahce enterprise, to ensure that they got the best price on goods, and then they would transport themselves onto Chickasaws. So again, just highlighting that area. So again, caveat with the Cherokee. I know what I know, but there are limits to that. When a political entity or a corporate identity is lost to history, that does not necessarily mean that it's gone. It just means that it's not necessarily found in a book that you can go back and find more information about. And so the stories about a time with the Cherokee, these are just dates. The gaps, the stories that fill those dates are the responsibility, or I'm trying to be respectful of those other tribes. So we know that in 1743, there was a town established off Hiawassee near a deep pool and a petroglyph. And they were there till 1755. One of the things that has been written about the Cherokee impressions of the Nahce were that they were wizards and sorcerers, but amazing dancers. And so we have an issue where we have a colonizing factor of religious entity come in. They need to establish a mission school. And so from what I understand, there was no representation on the council that decided that this piece of property where they had Nahce Town was to be the area where they would build the mission school. So they were displaced from that area, moved about 6.5 miles up to Brasstown Valley to a site along Gumog Creek and Brasstown Creek, where they say that they meshed with the Cherokees and that they no longer were a corporate entity. Now that is also what they said about the Creeks. And I'm here to tell you that that wasn't true about the Creeks. It's not true about the Chickasaws. It's probably not true about the Cherokee. So that there's other stories out there to be told. I also wanted to point out that there was some confusion, at least in some of the books, about when they arrived up in the Cherokee land. And apparently, the idea was that, pretty much they all came by way of the Creeks. And so I don't know if they were necessarily trying to get away from the Creeks, if they were trying to get closer to trade, if they were falling back on extremely old, ancient relationships in order to establish that place. But at least we know that they moved a little bit from Creek up to Cherokee country. So this is where we start talking about the interactions with the Creeks. So essentially, one of the things I kind of want to preface as you read through this is that I've gone through and I've changed the name to Arbika. Arbika is what we say now. We didn't necessarily used to have an R in our language. It's an aspirated H. So it would sound like Abika. And you can get a little bit of information about linguistics by the way that some of this stuff was written by Southern speakers. So, for example, a Southern speaker may spell declare, D-E-C-L-A-R-E. I hope I spelled that right. But they may say, I do declare. So the aspirated RH, it becomes heard as an R. And so you have like Yamakra, Arbika, a number of Creek words that start to be written in English with an R in them, even though an R isn't a sound that we make in our language. So Abika is a mother town of the Confederacy. They're an ancient town, and they were known as the gatekeepers of the Confederacy. So when the Nahce petitioned Abika, and Abika let them in, it also formed a relationship that's known as a mother-daughter town, in which they're always going to be connected, and essentially there's always going to be that connection between them, which surprisingly extends to this very day, which we will discuss. So just kind of show you a little bit more about these relationships in Alabama. I want to kind of zoom in on this part of the map here. And this is in 1814. So you have the Nahce and the Abika identified right next to each other, as fits up with oral traditions and historical accounts. But then you also have Chenubby's Fort and Fort Talladega. I feel like that maybe it was actually a little bit incorrectly stated there, because it was actually Fort Leslie, a trade fort of Alexander F. Leslie, who was a partner with Leslie Patton and Company, who would later go on to be Leslie Patton and Forbes, and later on to just Forbes. So Leslie Patton and Forbes at this time had a trade monopoly on the Creek Nation, and they had one of their traders stationed there at Fort Leslie. His son, he was married to a Nahce woman, and his son, also Alexander Leslie, was there. And this is an important time. Make sure that this is, So this whole region is actually filled with folks who have been traditionally, historically tied to the Nahce people. In 1770s, perhaps 1780s, the description was a Nahce town. In 1790, Caleb Swan came through and he described Nahce towns. So these are the Nahce towns that he's describing. 1823, so this is after Treaty of Fort Jackson, prior to to the 1826 treaties, which would have ceded most of Georgia. Even then, on maps, you have Nahce town showing up on Nahce Creek. You have Talladega, Fort Chenubby, again representing, as well as Fife's Village. James Fife is a signatory on one of the future treaties, and so he's also associated with the Nahce there. So this is where something unique happens. It's essentially an ethnogenesis of Talladega, tribal town, but it's an interesting thing because during the conflict, the Red Stick War, Abika declared themselves neutral. So that would have also indicated that Talladega, or the folks around Nahce town and those folks, would have also declared themselves as neutral. But that didn't stop them from being the target of a Red Stick party that would eventually come up and clash the Battle of Talladega. During that battle, there was a known figure named Eslakta, who's the son of Chenubby. And so historically, what happened was that they were Talladega and the folks that would become Talladega were neutral but attacked. And so from that point forward, it really coalesced people around that central part of Talladega. And if you look back at the town censuses, as you can see up there, you'll see the Nahce town, then it disappears, but you have counts with Breed Camp. Then you have back to Nahce Town, and then they mostly disappear until the 1832 census, where Talladega stands in their place. If you look at the treaties, 1790, 1796, 1814, these are all treaties where the Nahce, under the name and political entity of Nahce, signed treaties. The Esalacta signed an 1814 treaty under Nahce. He signed the 1826 treaty under the town of Talladega. So it is just a changing of names, which is something that is not necessarily unheard of. Another Creek town in 1790, after coming back from New York, the 1790 Treaty of New York, decided to change their name to New Yucca. So the idea of changing a tribal town name is not necessarily out of the question. So as I was mentioning earlier, this is Salacta. I did not do that. This is Salacta. The reason why there's a lot of information is because he was a party that, while the Talladega Fort, or Fort Leslie, was being sieged, he snuck out using a hog skin in order to go alert Jackson that the Red Sticks were there, which promptly formed a counterattack and lifted the siege. But I'm not a big fan of N.G. Jackson, so I'm just going to move on with that because, it's a part of history. But I want to go ahead and, so from 1820, essentially from, 26? I have to go back, I apologize. Yeah, 1826. Talladega was in Alabama. In the 1833 rolls of Creek Nation in the West, which have been a group of the early folks who had the means to migrate before forced removal, Talladega is the third largest town in Creek Nation. So the campaign, what I call the ethnic cleansing campaign. Ethnic cleansing was a coined term back then, but it is now, and if you identify a group based off their ethnicity and you want to displace them or kill them or get them out of there, it is ethnic cleansing. And so the American ethnic cleansing campaign of the Creeks to clear them out of our homelands and move us to Creek Nation in the West was almost a decade. So you have folks moving in 1827 all the way to prisoners being removed in 1837, with some stragglers in 1838. The ethnic cleansing campaign was very, very effective. There were no tribal towns left. There were no ceremonial grounds left. So there was no method of the culture continuing on. There may have been folks who were able to stay behind because they have changed the way that they live, but they wouldn't have been recognized as Creek folks later in time. So, as we move to Creek Nation, we base the 44 towns of the Creek Nation that you can also find in Alabama. When they were removed in groups together. On one hand, I can't imagine what it was like to be in a group with your family, watching them suffer. On the other hand, it allowed groups to maintain the way that their social cohesiveness, their cultural continuity, their leadership moved, their folks moved, and so essentially what they were doing in Alabama, they very much proceeded to do in Indian Territory after removal through the reestablishment process. So here we have Talladega down on the North Canadian River, established. This map was made, I believe, prior to 1912. I believe the grounds went dormant after 1912 sometime. But we had, after removal, we had about 30 years, less than 30 years, 20 years before outside instigators, as well as the folks who had been elevated to positions within the government because they were out here first, led to our involvement in the American Civil War, something that we should have never been involved with in the first place, but it did come to our reservation, came to Indian Territory. We have a Confederate treaty that we signed as a government. We also have the story of the Second Trail of Tears, which is all of the Creeks who, essentially, just like I said, this isn't our fight. We have treaties that they're supposed to care for us, they're supposed to keep these people out. And so thousands of them fled to Kansas in a running battle at sometimes with the Confederate Army, and then only to be unprovisioned up in Kansas and lead to even more deaths to exposure. But they volunteered for the 1st Indian Home Guard, and they were trained and outfitted, and they were returned to Indian Territory, and they defeated the Confederates at the Battle of Honey Springs, breaking the back of the Confederacy within Indian Territory. And so Creek history is similar to many other states where people fought on both sides, brothers versus brothers, etc. But it also caused a number of things, such as Reconstruction policies, to come into place. One of the articles of our Constitution, 1867 Constitution, I believe it's Article 10, allows the United States to make laws that impact us, the Creek people. So with that authority, they pass the Dawes and the Curtis Act. So Dawes Act initially didn't actually apply to the 5 tribes, Creek Nation in particular, and that was because we didn't have our lands held in trust for the United States as a reservation. We owned our lands in simple fee, as in the way that most people have private property. The Curtis Act dissolved our government so there wouldn't be an entity to own that land that would allow for the allotment process to go forth. So the Curtis Act also led to the confiscation of our council house and our orphans' home, and these were all things that our government had set up to provide for our citizens after the Civil War. So now I want to try to jump forward a little bit. This is a early Creek census card. My great-grandmother is up there, Polly Yonder. Tucker Marshall and Polly Yonder are in the orphan house in Muscogee, and that's because their parents had passed. But this is a very interesting thing because the concept of the family, the concept of who is responsible is not necessarily the father. Our culture shows that the mother's brother would be the one that would necessarily need to be able to take care of the children if something was to happen. And so John Bright is both Tucker Marshall and Polly Yonder's uncle. Betty Tulamasi is the sister of John Bright. So I wanted to show you what the Creek Orphan Home looked like. And this is in Muscogee. It's currently the well, I don't believe the building is still standing. When it was confiscated, eventually it became a POW or medical camp during World War II, and then was sold to the state for OSU IT. But this gives you a little bit of an idea of what was going on at the orphan home. There was essentially very different cultural experience than what most children would have gotten at the home. There was special money set aside for the education. There was a couple education schools, and then special appropriations for the orphans' home. And so they had resources and things like that. But I wanted to go back to a Dawes card. Most people are really unfamiliar with what this is or how this works, but this is essentially the pedigree that the government keeps on us through our citizenry. It's a really interesting thing. You know, we have our citizen's card versus our certificate of degree of Indian blood. That's held through BIA. And so, yeah, the government still does keep tabs on our how much Indian blood we do have. So this is the Dawes roll. This is what every citizen of the Creek Nation, not this specific one, there's 9,000 or so of them. This is what you use to determine your eligibility for citizenship in the nation. So these, again, Tucker Marshall, Polly Yonder, are the children of Betty to Marcy. Their town, as well as John Bright's, is mentioned as Talladega. And so I wanted to point this out because this is something that you probably wouldn't catch at first, but obviously when the people that were making up these cards, when they decided to do something, they thought about, well, of course the father needs to come first. He's the head of the family. And that doesn't work for Creek people who descend from mothers and through matrilineal. So all the folks that have the town besides the wife on here are all of Talladega, which is represented by the mother at the very end. And the men, the interconnectedness of our tribal towns, just on my Dawes card alone, I have ties to Kaileji, Hajichaba, Hijiti, Eufaula Canadian. And so even though you have a tribal town and that's your tribal town, you have all kinds of different kin relationships with other towns. So I wanted to show you, there's not been any pictures of these people up until this point in history. But this is courtesy of Tuskegee Indian Baptist Church. I didn't want to say that first. But there's Tucker Marshall. I think he had a hat on. Had to take it off for the picture. Because here's another picture of this house is still standing in Eufaula. And there he is sitting down. And so wanted to put a face to a name on a card that's a part of a record, that's part of my history and part of Creek history. Why Tucker Marshall is important and important to our story is because in the 1930s, linguist, oh my gosh, I temporarily forgot her first name, Haas. Anyway, she came and she interviewed a lot of folks, and they were her informants. And so it just so happens that Tucker Marshall was an informant for, I want to say Betty Haas. Anyway, and so this is a little blurb that she put into her book that was recently released. She did a lot of collections in the 30s. Some collaboration between some of the families and informants got that book published. And so, as you can see here, he identifies himself as Arbika Talladega. And this would have been in the 30s. And this is after I said that Talladega, the town itself, went dormant. And so by this time, a Talladega individual is identifying as Arbika Talladega. So I wanted to show you a picture of Polly, but there aren't any. But I do have a picture of Polly's children. So you have Stell in the middle. She was actually mentioned on the census card as number 3, the newborn. And so she got her own allotment. You have the twins, May and Mary, and then you got Jody and Woodrow. This is around, obviously, World War II time frame, and I believe this may be the last time that they were all together. Woodrow deployed and was shot down over Belgium. and later on still died in a car crash. But May and Mary, May is my grandmother, and so she was actually in Tulsa helping the war effort, so I hear, building planes, and so they all drove up to get a picture with her. So while they're all dressed to the hilt, she's in her work clothes, but that's some folks there. Additionally, wanted to point out, I don't get this platform very often, and so this picture of my grandmother over here is actually her senior picture. She didn't graduate high school with the other folks and had to make a deal with the superintendent of Stidham Public Schools so that they wouldn't lose funding for a student. So in 1969, my grandmother graduated from high school. But Woodrow is in the white suit. He used to be a teacher at Bacone College. And of course, he's up there as a sergeant. He was a tail gunner and in a bomber that was shot down over Belgium. And then, of course, here's a picture of Polly's great-grandchildren. There's May with her daughters. And it's coincident, all of the children that are in here are all children of her daughters. So matrilineal, here we are, all Talladega folks. And wanted to apologize to my cousin Rachel for cutting her head off. That's just the picture. But she also sent a lot of these pictures to help tell this story and add a little bit of a human element to it. So I want to shift, we got a little bit of time left, to the idea of cultural continuity. And this is where historians and archaeologists and me often butt heads. It is often viewed, well, I don't want to say that because that's me, how I view it. But essentially, the idea is that Abika's customs were the exact same customs and traditions and rights, and they honored the busk the same way that the Nahce did at Grand Village. And so when they came and they showed up as refugees looking for a new home, they didn't have to change all that much. And if you contrast that with the view of them being conjurers and wizards and sorcerers, there's an idea of one being accepted and one kind of having a different take on things. And so I say that only to drive home that the customs of the Creek people are essentially what they're talking about. So the idea of cultural continuity is the idea that ideas, values, meanings, the way you perceive the world around you is passed down through generations. This gentleman here is blowing a conch to indicate to the campground that services are about to begin. Now, this is a custom that is currently being done at a church, which I'll address here in a little bit. But the idea of blowing a conch when you're in landlocked Oklahoma, where does that come from? Where does that originate from? By far, back in our ancestral homelands. So before I get a little bit into that, I wanted to show you this weird coincidence because I like it. I see the two difference, and I think, well, they're not that different in some regards. So here you have the Coosa, Tallapoosa in Alabama, and the Chattahoochee. Towards the end, for a lot longer, we had a lot more to the east there, but towards the end, it was focused mostly on the Chattahoochee. And so the lower creek towns were found on the Chattahoochee, and the upper creek towns were found on the Tallapoosa and Coosa and Alabama rivers. So if we go back to our current reservation, you'll see something that kind of looks the same, but a lot of the towns down here are upper creek towns, and a lot of the towns up there are lower creek towns. So it seems like they switched. And of course, in reality they do, but if you were to turn that thing on its side, you really now have a very good analogy for the Chattahoochee, the Coosa, Tallapoosa, and the Alabama, although our reservation cuts off before they actually all join up. So when I'm dealing with cultural continuity and the ideas of culture, I have to address what other folks talk about as culture. And so these two little things, these two little definitions are what archaeology used to describe a culture. So when they talk about what are some of the Plaquemine culture, it's an idea that they're grouping the folks in the towns off of a series of traits. These folks lived in round houses, so they're the roundhouse people. These people lived in the square houses, they're the square house people. I come from a little bit different understanding of what culture is. In the Army, they taught me the Values, Beliefs, Behaviors, Norm model, VBBN. And so when I think of culture, I think of our values, like a Thlakwichka, Fachida, Macholgi, Yaskida, Hopithingi na Nakithkida. Our beliefs, how we still observe the Baskida, which means our religion is still being practiced. It's been practiced for over 1,000 years. Our behaviors, we have notorious Creek hospitality. We still identify our clan and our kin through our clan lines. We have speakers. Our norms, the way that we greet each other when we get into community settings. We have a gendered division of labor. These are all things that I think of when I think of culture, as opposed to a series of material remains recovered. And so I wanted to point that out, that there's a difference between when I talk about culture and what others may perceive as a culture. And the best way, I've seen that, this is one of my favorite little memes, because it's the best way to show that archaeologists are really good at archaeology, the science of it, the digging it up, the analysis. Where they always get in trouble is their interpretations. And that's because they're working without all that information that's below the water. That comes pretty easy to some folks because they're part of that culture. So going back to our connections between Nahce and Abika, I'm going to speed this up. This is Abika Indian Baptist Church. I also want to point out real quick that the cemetery is located nearby. The cemetery has grave houses on it. Grave house is a tradition that was started when basically they were told that burying their houses, their ancestors underneath their houses were pagan, and that you didn't need to do that anymore. And so grave houses were constructed to represent that idea. So here at a community, and this is a church, the caveat is that this church is an analogy for tribal town and a ceremonial ground. I have no right to show you ceremonial grounds or discuss them because I have not gotten permission. This is a church. They can deal with their sin if they get mad at me. But it's not too far for me to see how this set up around a central church / temple, religious place, and the camp houses representing different families, clans, is a pretty good analogy for the way that we've used space for a very long time. And I thought it was weird. I didn't think it was weird. I just thought that you guys may think it was weird, and maybe just a fluke that there was one that set up like that. But our churches, again, that are based off of our communities and our old tribal towns, it's very pervasive. Oh, you almost didn't catch it that I slipped into a little bit of older things. But I also want to give credit to Tony Boudreau for some of his work in identifying Mound E&D. That helps me paint an even better picture of how clans may have represented these mounds around the Grand Village. So, yeah, I'm sure I had another point to come back to with that one, but I'm not going to. So the Muscogee Creek Nation today, it's fourth largest tribe. 97,000 citizens. The national government operates on a $300 million budget. The goal of the nation is to provide certain services for our people, including housing, medical, security, education, various other social services. Here's our government. Our government's three branches of our government. We have an executive branch, judicial, and our legislative branch. When we reformed our Constitution in '79, we went from a bicameral legislative body to a unicameral legislative body. This plays into our story with the Nahce and Talladega a little bit, because the House of Kings and the House of Warriors, you were elected based off of your tribal town. And so you were always around your tribal town, et cetera, et cetera. When the Dawes and Curtis dissolved our government for a long time, things moved around. There was a lot of colonization impacts that were happening, a lot of land theft, a lot of death. Population numbers decreased. And then, sorry, I got into a little bit of time right there. When we reformed the Constitution, we formed it off of voting districts. So we have, I think, 6 or 7 different voting districts, and we'll get to that. I want to show you our principal chief, David Hill, our second chief, Del Beaver, our legislative branch, our national council. We have district courts and supreme courts that hand out justice. So within our reservation, which is 4,867 square miles, it consists of 11 whole and partial counties. We have the majority of the second largest city within our reservations, Tulsa, and that eight tribal voting districts. So I've caught myself on that one. Healthcare is very important for us. We operate 6 clinics across the reservation, 3 hospitals and a rehabilitation center. Our newest is Council Oak Comprehensive Healthcare. And they are spread out across the reservation, almost strategically, 45 minutes. This allows not just Creek citizens, but Oklahoma citizens and the community at large. For example, Okemah Hospital is a community hospital. That is a state-of-the-art facility that doctors will prefer to come from Oklahoma City to Okemah to do their procedures. And it's in a town that doesn't have a stoplight. It's just got a stop sign. And so taking healthcare and putting it into rural communities is part of the nation and part of our responsibilities. We also have a college, institution of higher education that's always growing and building. Recently, they've added the natural resources degree, so I'm pretty proud of them. Wanted to talk a little bit, show you a picture of the council house. This is the old version of the council house. It was burned down intentionally and rebuilt in stone in 1878. When it was confiscated from us, it was used by the state and folks for a number of years, and we actually had to end up buying it back from them. But it's back within the possession of the Muscogee Creek Nation and is now a museum that is open to the public. We have a meat processing facility that put basically, essentially, a grocery outlet, ability to buy food in the middle of a food desert. We have our own law enforcement and all that. I apologize for all that. That consists of numerous things, as well as security within trust and restricted properties. And then I kind of wanted to sum it up with this picture, which I'm glad it's about right on time. Because this picture is my grandmother's right there next to former Chief Claude Cox. And then that picture that I showed you earlier is down on the bottom. I believe her name is Milla. She is the older lady that's holding a young child. She was on the Trail of Tears, or what we would refer to as the Niñas de Mizca, or Road of Misery. She's there. The next little boy that's being held in the lap by the gentleman is also Solomon McCombs, who is the gentleman with the sunglasses on, standing over there, who was the second chief of the Creek Nation when they reformed the government. And I wanted to point this out because there's, for historical stake, the idea that our government had been abolished and then reformed is really just a blip in the eye. And that the way that we see time, or at least that I see time, is that these events, Civil War or removal, Civil War, Dawes, this is very much recent history for me. And so when I pointed all this stuff out, I wanted to connect, because Talladega and the role of Talladega, and Nahce into Talladega, and the role of the Creek Nation is so intertwined. There's so many variables. I cannot necessarily get into all of the details. But I wanted to hit a lot of those main points to talk a little bit about where they came, where the Nahce went after the French expelled them, expatriated them, expelled. Expelled was the word I was looking for. And so hopefully this connects a few dots, because in my mind it's pretty clear that Nahce folks lived a very long time after being expelled from here. They had almost 100 years of political autonomy, semi-political autonomy within the Creek Confederacy, and now they make up a town that numerous folks descend from and obtain their citizenry in the Creek Nation through. So hopefully that brings you up to the present. It's where I'm standing right now as a descendant of Nahce through Talladega, talking to you about my past. So are there any questions?
I am from a small town in southwest Mississippi called Natchez.
Natchez.
Right. I was amazed. I had really not heard the pronunciation that you were using. Nahce?
Nahce.
Okay. And I've been thinking about this. Could you help me understand the connection between that town of Natchez and the people that originally lived there and the Nahce that you were talking about as part of the Creek Nation?
Yeah. So Nahce, I apologize. I usually say the Nahce, or as most people refer to them, the Natchez, which is a plural. They tried to make it plural. You don't plurify. Why is that? I'm just making up words. You don't do that with Creek words, so it would just be Nahce instead of Natchez. But I'm sure that for English folks or French folks or European-speaking folks, they add an S to something, and so they're referring to the area, they're referring to the Nahce. So Natchez, Mississippi, the name comes from Natchez.
This is a great presentation, and it's good to see the authentic pronunciation of words that have been corrupted over the years. In the last 3 years, the U.S. government had a court decision making most of Oklahoma sovereign nation. Is that correct?
That is the McGirt decision through the Supreme Court.
Yes, talk about that, please.
Of course. I'm going to preface this with I'm not a lawyer. But historically speaking, the Dawes, the idea that the Curtis Act dissolved the government and the allotment process was the end of the Creek Nation. So that is what the state contended. Dadgum, those treaties got in the way because the idea that that power only remains because of Article 10 of that 1867 Constitution. That power remains within Congress, so only Congress can disestablish a reservation. So the decision was centered around whether or not Congress had ever done that. And so they hadn't. So the reservation has always been there. It's just been completely disregarded by federal, state agencies. And all of that, we're hoping, it's an unprecedented situation. It's going to call for cool, level heads and patience. We need willing partners. Sometimes we have willing partners within the state, sometimes we don't. But it is one of those things that still, like the ramifications of it, we're still working through those things. But yeah, it was probably one of the most monumentous decisions in Indian country over the last couple decades, which is immediately attacked.
I'm curious too. When I was in Arizona, I visited the reservation out there, and it was the first time that I had a light bulb, what I think was a light bulb moment, that we had a nation within the nation. And I'm wondering how true is that, and how the reservations interact with the federal government. So are they?
Yeah.
Do we have nation within the nation?
Of course. That's the basis behind a sovereign nation, and in our case, a treaty tribe. I mentioned earlier those pesky treaties get in the way. They would call for a time where we had no government, but you had to have a decision by a chief, and so the federal government would come in and appoint a chief in order to get some business done. And so the idea that non-sovereign entity was there, I don't know. All that to say, the reason why I'm here in Mississippi is for a government-to-government consultation, even though it's with the state, so we'll call it a summit. But the idea is that I go around and I deal with federal agencies often, and the status of the lands in which we work on is often a hot topic. So there is a different course of action for things that happen on the reservation versus happens within our ancestral homelands. I'm trying to think, there was one other thing. What happened is that the United States used treaties with Native American tribes to substantiate itself. So it knew after the common practice at the time, Britain, Spain, France, was to secure treaties because these were recognized as sovereign entities. So when America rebelled and became a thing, they wanted to substantiate themselves as a nation. So they had to formulate treaties with the folks around them, which was tribal nations. So that all was good, but populations on our side, at least with the Creeks, kept crashing while the populations of Americans kept going and going and going and going. And so at one point in time, they became so powerful that they said, you know what, you're no longer a sovereign nation, you're a domestic dependent nation. But the only reason why we're domestic was because they had surrounded us, and the only reason why we're dependent is because they made promises within those treaties to care for us. And so through that course of action, that's how we got a number of laws passed. And that was all just done on an 1871 rider for an appropriations bill. They're like, hey, let's just quit calling them sovereign nations, let's call them domestic dependent nations. And it worked.
We're getting close to the top of the hour, but I want to pass along. A few folks in the live stream have asked about the Nahce in traveling to South Carolina and the Petey there?
Yeah, so I am a representative of a federally recognized tribe. The Nahce, those groups are folks who typically self-identify. They may have some history there. I'm not going to say one way or another whether or not it's real or not. But I will say that if anyone was seeking recognition, that the idea that you're Nahce from somewhere else being treated historically as a tribe, which is a requirement for federal recognition, that would fall to the Nahce within the Creek Nation who maintain political autonomy throughout removal into 1900s and still identify themselves through their tribal town within the Creek Nation. So if you were looking to be treated historically as the tribe of Nahce, that's going to be within the Muscogee Creek Nation.
You mentioned Arbika. In my readings and work, since you talked about it, I've encountered Abika, A-B-I-E-K-A. Have you seen that? And then also, it had more of a spiritual definition to it?
Oh, yeah. Abika, the way it's written on maps, depending on whether it's Spanish, French, English, American, varies. They all kind of phonetically sound the same, but the Abika that is typically referenced in any type of relationship with the Creek Confederacy or being a mother town is now known as Arbika. And I did kind of forget to mention this part, and my deepest apologies, but they do continue. Arbika Talladega ceremonial grounds continues to this day. They functioned throughout the time where there was dissolution of the government. They continued on doing their thing, and they have a very vibrant culture that's their story to tell. And so I don't want to get into any of the spiritual meanings because that refers back to a story that's not mine necessarily to tell.
I'm sorry, we've gone a little past our time, but I love that there are always more questions than we have time for. I'm sure Turner will be glad to answer any questions you may have after. Thank you all for being here. I hope that you will remember to come back at the end of the week as we celebrate the 5th anniversary of the opening of these museums, and then come back next Wednesday for our final History is Lunch of 2023 with Marty Stewart. For now, help me thank Turner Hunt for this program today.
Thank you.